A homeless girl whispers one word to a millionaire, and something in him snaps. He slams the brakes on his entire life, chasing a shadow through the darkest corners of the city. He doesn't know who she is, or why that word hit him like a ghost from the past. But the deeper he digs, the more his perfect world starts to crack. Old secrets are waking up, and not everyone wants them found. Why did that one word make a broken man fall to his knees? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Sterling Whitlow stared out the tinted window of his black limousine. The city lights blurred past him in streaks of gold and white, but he hardly noticed them. His mind was elsewhere, lost in spreadsheets and business deals that would add more millions to his already substantial fortune. "We should arrive at the charity gala in 15 minutes, sir," his driver, Marcus, announced through the intercom. Sterling didn't respond. He just gave a small nod that no one could see and straightened his bow tie. The custom-made suit fit him perfectly, as all his clothes did. At 62, his silver hair was immaculately styled, and his angular face showed the confidence of a man who controlled everything in his world. Everything except happiness. The limousine slowed to a stop at a red light in a part of town Sterling rarely noticed. It was neither poor enough to avoid, nor rich enough to frequent. Just another stretch of ordinary city blocks with ordinary people living ordinary lives. Sterling checked his watch. The Whitlow Shipping Foundation would be presenting a large check tonight. The photographers would capture his practiced smile. The newspapers would praise his generosity. And tomorrow, nothing in his life would be different. A soft tapping sound pulled Sterling from his thoughts. There, pressed against his window, was a small hand. Dirty fingers splayed against the glass. Sterling leaned forward, his brow furrowed. A girl stood beside his car. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. Her dark hair hung in matted clumps around a thin face. She wore a tattered coat, much too big for her small frame. Her feet were bare despite the biting December cold. But it was her eyes that made Sterling's breath catch. Deep, knowing eyes that seemed to see right through the tinted glass, right through his expensive suit, right into the empty chambers of his heart. Her lips moved, forming a single word. Sterling couldn't hear it through the soundproofed car, but he could read it clearly. "Help!" "Sir?" Marcus called through the intercom. "There's a child by your window. Should I—" "Wait," Sterling said, his voice suddenly urgent. But before he could lower the window, the light changed to green. A car behind them honked impatiently. "Sir?" Marcus prompted. Sterling's eyes remained fixed on the spot where the girl had stood, but she was already gone, vanished into the shadows between streetlights. "Sir, we need to move," Marcus said. Sterling felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a disruption to his carefully ordered world, a crack in the wall he'd built around himself. "Find her," he said, the words leaving his mouth before he'd even formed the thought. "Excuse me, sir?" "The girl. Find her." Sterling's voice grew firmer. "Turn around. Drive slowly." "But the gala—" "Cancel it." Sterling reached for his phone. "Cancel everything." Marcus hesitated only a moment before making a careful U-turn at the next intersection. Sterling quickly sent messages to his assistant, canceling his appearances for the evening. "Drive slowly," Sterling repeated. "She can't have gone far." They cruised the streets, Sterling's eyes scanning every alley, every doorway. The word echoed in his mind. Help. Just one simple word, but it had pierced through decades of careful emotional detachment. "There, sir." Marcus pointed to a narrow alley between two buildings. Sterling caught a glimpse of movement, a small figure darting behind a dumpster. "Stop the car," he commanded. "Sir, this isn't a safe neighborhood to—" "Stop the car, Marcus." The limousine pulled to the curb. Sterling didn't wait for Marcus to open his door. He stepped out into the cold evening air, the winter chill biting through his expensive wool coat. "Stay with the car," he told Marcus, whose concerned face showed he clearly thought this was a terrible idea. Sterling approached the alley slowly. The girl was hiding behind the dumpster, watching him with those penetrating eyes. She looked ready to bolt at any second. "Hello," Sterling said softly, stopping several feet away. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond. She just stared, her small body trembling from cold or fear, perhaps both. "You asked for help," Sterling continued. "I'd like to help you if you'll let me." Still no response. Just those eyes, assessing him, judging whether he could be trusted. Sterling slowly removed his coat, bending down to place it on the ground between them. "You must be freezing," he said. "Please take it." The girl didn't move toward the coat. Sterling noticed her bare feet, red and raw from the cold pavement. "What's your name?" he asked. Silence stretched between them. In the distance, a siren wailed. The girl flinched at the sound. "My name is Sterling," he offered, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "Sterling Whitlow." The girl's eyes widened slightly at his last name. Did she recognize it? The Whitlow name was on buildings and ships throughout the city. "Are you hungry?" Sterling asked. "I can get you something to eat." A tiny nod. The first response. "Would you like to come with me?" "Get something warm to eat? No obligations. You can leave whenever you want." The girl glanced toward the street, then back at Sterling. Slowly, so slowly, she stepped forward and picked up his coat. It swallowed her small frame completely when she put it on. "That's good," Sterling said encouragingly. "What would you like to eat?" The girl's lips parted. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely audible. "Pizza." Sterling felt an unexpected smile form on his lips. "Pizza it is." As they walked back toward the limousine, Sterling maintained a respectful distance. The girl followed cautiously, still ready to run at the slightest provocation. Marcus's eyes widened when he saw them approach, but he quickly composed himself and opened the car door. The girl hesitated at the open door, looking up at Sterling with uncertainty. "It's all right," Sterling assured her. "Just a warm car and then some pizza, I promise." She climbed in, perching on the edge of the leather seat as if afraid to fully commit to being there. As Sterling settled in beside her, though not too close, he felt that word still resonating within him. Help. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Sterling Whitlow had no idea what would happen next. And strangely, that felt like exactly what he needed. Sterling ordered pizza for the girl, who ate with a quiet intensity that spoke of real hunger. She answered his questions with nods or single words, never volunteering information. When he asked her name, she finally whispered, "Ilara." After she'd eaten her fill, Sterling arranged a room at a nearby hotel, a clean, safe place where she could rest. He left his business card and a promise to return in the morning. The girl had simply nodded, clutching his coat around her thin shoulders. Now, as afternoon faded into evening, Sterling found himself in parts of the city he'd never visited before. Places the limousine drew stares. Places where the Whitlow name adorned no buildings. "The Hope Harbor shelter is just ahead, sir," Marcus said, pulling up to a weathered brick building with a hand-painted sign. Sterling straightened his tie. "Wait here." Inside, the shelter smelled of industrial cleaner and reheated soup. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair looked up from the front desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her expression curious as she took in Sterling's expensive suit. "I'm looking for information about a young girl," Sterling explained. "Around 12 years old, dark hair, thin, possibly homeless." The woman's expression immediately cooled. "We protect our guests' privacy here, Mr. Whitlow, Sterling Whitlow." Recognition flickered in her eyes. "The shipping magnate?" Sterling nodded. "Well, Mr. Whitlow, unless you're a relative or legal guardian." "I'm trying to help her," Sterling interrupted. "She approached me on the street today. Asked for help." The woman studied him, measuring his sincerity. "We see a lot of young people in crisis here. What makes this girl special to you?" The question caught Sterling off guard. What did make Alara special? Why had her whispered plea cut through his carefully constructed walls? "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't ignore it." Something in his honesty seemed to soften the woman's stance. "I haven't seen anyone matching that description recently, but you might try Saint. Catherine's over on Maple. They work specifically with youth." "Thank you," Sterling said, leaving a sizable donation before departing. St. Catherine's yielded no information. Neither did the community center on 4th Street, nor the free clinic in the warehouse district. As night fell, Sterling found himself walking the same streets where he'd found Alara, peering into alleys and doorways. "You never give up, do you?" The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, echoing in his mind. Sterling froze mid-step, his heart lurching painfully in his chest. Renata. The memory crashed over him like a wave. Renata laughing as they ran through summer rain, her curly chestnut hair plastered to her face, eyes alight with joy. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met, Sterling Whitlow," she'd said, pulling him into a kiss that tasted of rain and promise. Sterling blinked, and the memory dissolved. He was still standing on the cold street corner, alone. It had been years since he'd allowed himself to think of Renata. Years of careful compartmentalization, of burying those memories so deeply they couldn't hurt him anymore. Why now? What was it about this girl, about Alara, that had cracked open that sealed vault? Sterling continued his search, moving from one shelter to another. At each stop, he left his card, a description of Alara, and the promise of a reward for information. As he waited for Marcus to bring the car around from the latest shelter, another memory surfaced. Renata sitting across from him at a tiny restaurant table, candlelight playing across her features. "What would you do?" she'd asked, twirling pasta on her fork. "If you didn't have your father's expectations hanging over you?" Sterling had no answer then. He'd never considered a life outside the path laid before him, heir to the Whitlow empire, future captain of industry. "I don't know," he'd finally said. Renata had reached across the table, her warm fingers closing over his. "That's the saddest thing I've ever heard." The memory shifted, darkened. His father's study, the heavy oak desk between them. "She's a waitress, Sterling, a nobody." His father's voice cold and dismissive. "End it now, or I'll end it for you." "I love her," Sterling had insisted, the only time he'd ever directly opposed his father. "Love?" His father had laughed. "Love doesn't build empires. Love doesn't secure legacies. You'll thank me one day." But Sterling never had. Not when Renata stopped answering his calls. Not when she disappeared from the restaurant where she worked. Not when his private investigator reported she'd left town, gone without a trace. "Sir?" Marcus's voice pulled Sterling back to the present. "It's getting late. Perhaps we should continue tomorrow?" Sterling checked his watch. Past midnight. "One more stop," he said. "The women's shelter on River Street." The shelter director, a no-nonsense woman named Gloria, listened to Sterling's description with a frown. "We had a girl like that stay with us briefly last month," she said. "Wouldn't give a last name, wouldn't talk about family. She left after 3 days." Sterling felt a surge of hope. Did she mention where she was going? Gloria shook her head. But she had a necklace she never took off. A little silver pendant, a bird of some kind. Sterling's world tilted sharply. A silver bird pendant. He'd given one to Renata on their 6-month anniversary, a little swallow in flight. "Freedom," he'd told her, "because that's what you've given me." "Are you all right, Mr. Whitlow?" Gloria asked. "You've gone quite pale." "The girl," Sterling managed, his voice barely audible. "How old did you say she was?" "I didn't, but I'd guess around 12, maybe 13. 12 years. Almost exactly the time since Renata had disappeared from his life. The realization hit Sterling with physical force. He reached for the wall to steady himself. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible, but those eyes. Those hauntingly familiar eyes that had looked up at him and whispered, "Help." Sterling left the women's shelter with his mind spinning. The silver bird pendant, 12 years. Those eyes that seemed to reach into his soul. He stumbled slightly as he walked to the car, his normally perfect composure cracking. "Sir?" Marcus asked, concern evident in his voice. "Are you unwell?" "I'm fine," Sterling answered automatically, though he was anything but. "Drive around the neighborhood again." Slowly. For the next hour, they cruised the darkened streets. Sterling's eyes scanned every shadow, every doorway, every alley. The rational part of his brain told him this was futile, that finding one small girl in a city this size was impossible. But something deeper, something he couldn't name, drove him forward. "Sir, it's nearly 2 in the morning," Marcus said gently. "Perhaps we should—" "There!" Sterling pointed sharply to a narrow alley between a grocery store and a laundromat. "Pull over." He was out of the car before it fully stopped, moving with a speed and urgency that surprised even himself. The alley was dark, lit only by the distant glow of a street lamp. The smell of rotting food and garbage hit him as he approached the large dumpster. And then he saw her. Ilara lay crumpled behind the dumpster, her small body curled into itself like a wounded animal. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and uneven. "Ilara," he whispered, kneeling beside her, not caring about the filth soaking into his expensive suit pants. "Ilara, can you hear me?" She didn't respond. Up close, Sterling could see how truly fragile she was, Skin stretched too tight over bones, lips cracked from dehydration, dark circles under her eyes. "Marcus," he called out, his voice cracking. "Call an ambulance." "No ambulance," Alara whispered suddenly, her eyes fluttering open for just a moment. "They'll find me." "Who will find you?" Sterling asked, but she had already slipped back into unconsciousness. A decision formed in his mind with startling clarity. "Marcus, forget the ambulance. We're taking her to Memorial Hospital ourselves. It's faster." Carefully, with a gentleness he didn't know he possessed, Sterling gathered the girl into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a bird with hollow bones. Her head lolled against his chest as he carried her to the car. "Sir, perhaps we should call the authorities," Marcus suggested as he held the car door open. "Not yet," Sterling said firmly. "She's afraid of something, or someone. Let's get her medical help first." The drive to Memorial Hospital took only minutes, but to Sterling it felt like hours. He held Alara's limp form against him, feeling each shallow breath she took as if it were a precious gift. At the emergency entrance, everything happened in a blur. Sterling's name and wealth opened doors immediately. He gave them a false last name for Alara, Johnson, and claimed she was his niece. The hospital staff didn't question him, too focused on the critically ill child. "Severe malnutrition," he heard one doctor say. "Possible pneumonia." "Dehydration," said another. "Get an IV started immediately." They wheeled her away on a gurney, leaving Sterling standing alone in the hallway, his empty arms still curved as if holding her. A nurse approached him with clipboard and forms. "Sir, we need some information about your niece." Sterling nodded numbly, taking the clipboard. As he started to fill out the forms with fabricated information, a young orderly approached. "Mr. Whitlow, we found this in the girl's coat pocket. We thought you might want to hold on to it for her." The orderly handed him a small, torn photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. Sterling thanked him automatically, glancing down at the image. His heart stopped. The photograph showed a young woman with curly chestnut hair, her face glowing with exhausted joy as she cradled a newborn baby. Renata. Her smile was exactly as he remembered, warm, genuine, lighting up her entire face. The baby in her arms was tiny, wrapped in a simple white blanket. But what made Sterling's hands shake uncontrollably was who was visible in the background. The image was torn, but there was no mistaking the tall figure standing slightly behind Renata, his face partially visible at the edge of the photo. It was Sterling himself, a photograph he had no memory of, a baby he had never known existed, a moment in time that had been erased from his life. Sterling sank slowly into a nearby chair, the photograph clutched in his trembling hands. The world around him seemed to fade away. The bustling hospital noises, the bright fluorescent lights, the antiseptic smell. All of it receded as he stared at the impossible image. "Mr. Whitlow?" A doctor was standing before him, chart in hand. "Your niece is stabilized. We've started her on antibiotics for the pneumonia and fluids for the dehydration. She's severely malnourished, but with proper care, she should recover physically." Sterling looked up, feeling as if he were surfacing from deep water. "Can I see her?" The doctor nodded. "She's sedated, but you can sit with her. Room 312. Sterling found his way to the room, moving like a man in a dream. Alara lay in the hospital bed, looking even smaller, surrounded by machines and monitors. An IV dripped fluid into her arm. Her breathing seemed easier now, less labored. He pulled a chair close to her bedside and sat down heavily, still clutching the photograph. Looking from the image to the girl's face, he could see it now. The shape of her eyes, the curve of her cheek. Renata's features softened and mingled with his own. "Who are you?" he whispered to the sleeping child. "What happened to your mother? And why didn't I know about you?" The monitors beeped steadily in the quiet room, offering no answers to his questions. Sterling couldn't sleep that night. He sat beside Alara's hospital bed, the torn photograph resting on his knee, his mind racing with impossible thoughts. Every few minutes, he would look from the photo to the sleeping child's face, searching for confirmation of what his heart already knew. Morning came with pale light filtering through the hospital blinds. Sterling rubbed his tired eyes and made a call. "Charles, it's Sterling Whitlow. I need your lab services today. Most urgent priority." He paused, listening. "Yes, I understand it's Saturday. I'll triple your weekend rate." 2 hours later, Sterling stood in the pristine offices of Meridian Laboratories, a private facility known for its discretion and efficiency. The photograph lay on a scanner while a technician in a white coat worked at a computer. "We can enhance the image, Mr. Whitlow," the technician explained. "The tear obscures part of your face, but we can clearly confirm it's you in the background." Sterling nodded stiffly. "What about the date? Can you determine when this was taken?" The technician studied the back of the photograph where faint numbers were visible. "Based on the paper stock and developing technique, this is approximately 8 to 9 years old." 8 years. The timing aligned perfectly with Renata's disappearance from his life. "I'll need something else," Sterling said, his voice tight. "DNA testing. I need to know if that child is—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "We can do that, sir. We'll need samples." Sterling handed over a sealed bag containing Alara's hairbrush that he'd taken from her backpack, along with a swab from his own cheek. The technician accepted them without question. "How soon can you have results?" Sterling asked. "For you, Mr. Whitlow, by tomorrow morning." Sterling returned to the hospital to find Alara awake. Her eyes, dark and wary, followed him as he entered the room. She still hadn't spoken a word since that single plea for help. "Hello?" he said softly, taking the chair beside her bed. "The doctors say you're getting stronger." Alara watched him, her small face unreadable. The nurses had washed her hair, revealing it to be a deep chestnut color, just like her mother's. "I found the picture you were carrying," Sterling said, carefully placing it on the edge of her bed. "That's your mother, isn't it?" A flicker of emotion crossed the girl's face. Pain, longing, love. She reached for the photograph with thin fingers and held it close to her chest. "Her name was Renata," Sterling continued, his voice catching. "I knew her. She was—" He struggled to find words simple enough for a child to understand, yet true enough to honor what Renata had been to him. "She was very special to me." Alara's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with an intensity that made Sterling uncomfortable. There was wisdom in that gaze, the kind that came only from suffering. That night, Sterling barely slept again. His mind kept returning to those final days with Renata, 8 years ago. How she'd tried to tell him something important. How his father had intervened, claiming she was after the Whitlow fortune. How Sterling had been too weak, too obedient to stand up to Roman. She left because she was paid to leave, Roman had told him. She took the money and ran. That's all you need to know. And Sterling had believed him, or pretended to believe him, which was worse. The next morning, Sterling arrived at Meridian Laboratories as soon as they opened. Charles, the director, met him personally. "We have your results, Mr. Whitlow," he said, leading Sterling to a private office. "The analysis is conclusive." Sterling took the folder with shaking hands. The scientific language blurred before his eyes, but one line stood out in stark clarity. Probability of paternity, 99.99998%. "She's mine," Sterling whispered, though he'd known it from the moment he saw the photograph. "She's my daughter." "Yes, sir," Charles confirmed. "There's no question about it." Sterling sat motionless, the weight of this truth pressing on his chest until he could barely breathe. He had a child, a daughter who had been living on the streets, starving and afraid, while he lived in luxury. "Thank you, Charles," he finally managed. "Your discretion in this matter is essential." "Of course, Mr. Whitlow, all records will be sealed." Back in his car, Sterling couldn't bring himself to start the engine. The memories came flooding back with brutal clarity. Renata telling him she needed to talk about something important. His father's sudden interest in his relationship. The business trip Roman had insisted Sterling take. And when he returned, Renata was gone. "She left this for you," Roman had said, handing Sterling an envelope containing the diamond bracelet he'd given her and a note he now realized couldn't possibly have been written by Renata. The truth hit him like a physical blow. His father hadn't just paid Renata to leave, he had forced her out, threatened her, and the hit-and-run accident that had killed her 2 years later, had that been an accident at all? By the time Sterling arrived back at the hospital, his grief had hardened into resolve. He found Alara sitting up in bed, a social worker beside her. "Mr. Whitlow," the woman said, rising to greet him. "I'm Clara Simmons from Child Protective Services. Since your niece has no identification and appears to be homeless, we'll need to place her in temporary foster care once she's discharged." "That won't be necessary," Sterling said firmly. "She's not my niece. She's my daughter." The social worker's eyebrows rose. "Your daughter? Do you have documentation to—" "I have DNA test results," Sterling interrupted, placing the folder on the bed. "And I'm prepared to sign whatever acknowledgement of paternity is required." Ms. Simmons looked startled. "This is unusual, Mr. Whitlow. There will be investigations, questions about why you haven't been in her life." "I understand, and I'll answer everything." Sterling turned to Alara, whose eyes had grown wide. "If that's what she wants." For the first time since he'd found her, Alara's expression changed completely. The wariness remained, but now there was something else. A flicker of hope, quickly guarded. She didn't speak, but her eyes never left his face. Sterling spent the next few days setting up a private suite for Alara in his penthouse. The girl remained mostly silent, watching him with cautious eyes that missed nothing. She spoke only when necessary, in short, careful sentences. Trust would take time Sterling was determined to give her. But while he prepared a safe home for his daughter, his mind churned with darker questions. Renata's death had never made sense. A hit and run at midnight on a quiet street. No witnesses, no suspects. Case closed within weeks. I need to know what happened, he whispered to himself one night, staring at the old photograph of Renata. Her smile seemed to challenge him. Find the truth. Be brave this time. The next morning, after making sure Alara was comfortable with Mrs. Chen, the kind-hearted housekeeper he'd hired, Sterling began his investigation. He started at the Public Records Office, requesting the police report on Renata's accident. The clerk handed him a thin folder. Not much here, Mr. Whitlow. Hit-and-run cases go cold fast without witnesses. Sterling flipped through the sparse pages. Time of death, 11:47 p.m. Location, corner of Maple and 23rd. No skid marks, no camera footage noted, no follow-up interviews after the initial canvass, and it felt wrong. Too clean, too quick. His next stop was the precinct that had handled the case. Detective Miller was retired now, but agreed to meet Sterling for coffee. Yeah, I remember that one, Miller said, stirring sugar into his cup. Pretty young woman. Terrible shame. Was there anything unusual about the case? Sterling asked. Miller's eyes narrowed slightly. Funny you should ask. There was something that always bothered me. We got called off the investigation real quick. Captain said resources were needed elsewhere. Called off? By whom? Miller shrugged. Above my pay grade. But I'd been a cop long enough to know when pressure was coming from somewhere with money. Sterling felt sick. Was there any security footage? Nothing in our files, but... Miller leaned forward. The bodega across from the accident had cameras. Owner told us they weren't working that night, but he seemed scared. I always wondered. The bodega was still there, though under new ownership. Sterling tracked down the previous owner, now running a small grocery in the suburbs. I don't talk about that night, Mr. Patel said firmly when Sterling mentioned the date. Please leave. Sterling placed a photograph of Alara on the counter. This is her daughter. She's 8 years old and has been living on the streets since her mother died. I need to know what happened. Mr. Patel's stern expression crumbled. They told me to say the cameras were broken. They weren't. His voice dropped to a whisper. I still have the tape. I could never bring myself to destroy it, even though they paid me to. The grainy footage showed everything. A black sedan with tinted windows circling the block 3 times. Renata walking home from her late shift. The car accelerating directly toward her. No attempt to brake. Then speeding away. It wasn't an accident, Sterling said, his voice hollow. No, sir, Mr. Patel agreed sadly. That poor woman was murdered. Back in his car, Sterling's hands shook so badly he couldn't start the engine. Murder. Renata had been murdered. And based on what Miller had said about the investigation being shut down, someone powerful had covered it up. He knew in his gut who that someone was. That evening, Sterling sat with Alara as she picked at her dinner. I need to ask you something important, he said gently. About your mom, about what happened to her. Alara's fork clattered to her plate. Her eyes went wide with fear. You saw it, didn't you? Sterling asked, his heart breaking. A single nod. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the black car. It came straight at her. I was waiting across the street. Tears filled her eyes. She told me to run if anything bad happened. So I ran. Sterling reached across the table, offering his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Ilara placed her small hand in his. "I'm going to find out who did this," he promised, "and they'll never hurt you." The final piece came from Edwin, who had been his father's driver for 30 years before retiring. Sterling found him living in a modest house paid for by the Whitlow family. "Mr. Sterling," Edwin said, clearly surprised to see him at the door. "What brings you here?" "The truth, Edwin. About Renata Diaz. About what happened to her." The old man's face went ashen. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I think my father had her killed." Edwin's shoulders sagged. He suddenly looked 20 years older. "You'd better come in." They sat in Edwin's small living room surrounded by photographs of his grandchildren. The old man's hands trembled as he poured tea. "Your father found out she was pregnant," Edwin finally said. "He offered her money to disappear. She refused, said the baby deserved to know its father." Sterling closed his eyes, pain washing over him. "Mr. Roman was furious, said she was trying to trap you, ruin the Whitlow name." Edwin's voice cracked. "When she had the baby, a little girl, and still refused to leave town, he said she needed to be removed from the equation." "And you know this how?" Sterling asked, though he dreaded the answer. Tears streamed down Edwin's weathered face. "Because I drove the car that night. I swear I didn't know what was planned. He told me to pick up his associate and follow his instructions. The man made me circle the block, then grabbed the wheel." Edwin broke down completely. "I've lived with this sin every day since. God forgive me. I was too afraid to speak up." Sterling sat in stunned silence, the horrible truth finally laid bare. His own father had ordered Renata's murder, had robbed Ilara of her mother, had robbed him of the woman he loved and the chance to know his daughter. "I'm so sorry," Edwin sobbed. "Your father, he's a monster." "Yes," Sterling said, his voice deadly calm as a cold clarity settled over him. "Yes, he is." The evening sky turned deep purple as Sterling drove to his father's estate. The sprawling mansion sat on a hill, its windows glowing like cold, watchful eyes. Sterling had grown up in that house, but it had never felt like home. Tonight it felt like a fortress of lies. He parked his car in the circular driveway and sat for a moment, gathering his strength. The truth weighed on him like a stone. His father, his own father, had ordered the murder of Renata, the only woman Sterling had ever truly loved, had robbed their daughter of her mother, had robbed him of 8 years he could have spent being a father. "I'll be right back," he whispered to Ilara, who was curled up asleep in the back seat, her small face peaceful for once. He hadn't wanted to leave her alone, but he couldn't bear to bring her into that house, not with Roman in it. The old butler opened the door with a surprised expression. "Mr. Sterling, we weren't expecting you." "Where is he, Charles?" "In his study, sir." Sterling walked the familiar hallway, past portraits of Whitlow men going back generations. Cold, stern faces. Had they all been capable of such cruelty? He didn't knock. Roman Whitlow sat behind his massive desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed documents. At 78, he was still formidable. Silver-haired and ramrod straight, his eyes sharp as ever. "Sterling." He didn't seem surprised. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" "Renata Diaz," Sterling said, his voice steady despite the rage boiling inside him. Something flickered in Roman's eyes, not guilt but wariness. What about her? I know what you did. Roman removed his reading glasses and set them on the desk with deliberate care. Do you now? You had her killed. You arranged it to look like an accident. The old man didn't flinch, didn't deny it. He simply studied his son with those cold gray eyes. And what evidence do you think you have of this absurd accusation? Edwin confessed, and Mr. Patel from the convenience store kept the security footage. Sterling's hands curled into fists. But most damning of all, you're not even denying it. A long silence filled the room. Then Roman sighed as if merely inconvenienced. She was a problem that needed solving, he said flatly. She refused a very generous offer to disappear. She insisted on keeping that child and staying in the city where she might embarrass the family. What choice did I have? The casual cruelty of it stole Sterling's breath. What choice? You could have let me make my own decisions. You could have let me be with the woman I loved, raise my own child. Roman's lip curled. Love? She was a waitress, Sterling, a nobody, and you are a Whitlow. Do you think this family built its empire by indulging in romantic fantasies? She was carrying your grandchild, Sterling said, his voice breaking. My daughter, Ilara. A mistake, one I took care of, as I've always taken care of everything for this family. Roman stood up, his movement stiff but purposeful. Where is this sudden moral outrage coming from? You left that woman when I told you to. You married Caroline when I arranged it. You've enjoyed every privilege the Whitlow name has given you. The truth of it stung. Sterling had been a coward. He'd allowed himself to be controlled, had abandoned Renata when she needed him most. You're right, Sterling admitted. I've been weak. I've been your puppet. But that ends now. Roman's eyes narrowed. What exactly do you think you're going to do? I'm going to raise my daughter. I'm going to tell her the truth about her mother, how brave she was, how much she loved her. And I'm going to make sure she knows exactly what kind of man you are. Don't be dramatic, Roman scoffed. Think of the Whitlow legacy. Think of the scandal if this gets out. Sterling laughed bitterly. The Whitlow legacy? Is that what matters to you? Not the fact that you had an innocent woman murdered? Not the fact that your granddaughter has been living on the streets, hungry and afraid? Sentimentality, Roman spat. It's weakness. I thought I taught you better. You taught me to be cold, to put money and status above human life. Sterling moved closer to the desk. I'm done with your lessons. You'll ruin everything I've built, Roman warned. No, Sterling said quietly. I'll build something better, something Renata would have been proud of. He turned to leave, but Roman's voice stopped him. If you walk out that door with these ridiculous notions, you're no longer my son. Sterling looked back at the old man, diminished somehow despite his expensive suit and powerful desk. I stopped being your son the moment I learned what you did to Renata. The drive back to the city was quiet. In the rearview mirror, Sterling could see Ilara still sleeping, her small chest rising and falling peacefully. She looked so much like her mother it made his heart ache. He pulled into the parking garage of his building and gently lifted Ilara from the back seat. She stirred slightly but didn't wake, her head nestling against his shoulder. The trust in that simple gesture nearly broke him. I've got you, he whispered, carrying her to the elevator. I'm here now. In his apartment, he carefully laid her on the bed in the guest room, her room now. He pulled the blanket over her and, after a moment's hesitation, bent down and kissed her forehead. His first fatherly kiss. It felt both strange and perfectly right. Ilara's eyelids fluttered, but she didn't wake. In the dim light, with her dark hair spread across the pillow, she looked so much like Renata that memories flooded back unbidden. Renata laughing as they walked along the river, Renata's eyes sparkling as she teased him about his serious nature, the way she'd cup his face in her hands when they kissed, as if holding something precious. The night she'd whispered she loved him, and he'd felt for the first time in his life that someone saw him, really saw him, not just the Whitlow heir. A tear slipped down Sterling's cheek. What might have been if he'd been stronger, if he'd stood up to his father then instead of now when it was too late. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to Ilara or to Renata's memory. "I'll protect her with my life. I promise you that." He stood in the doorway a long time watching his daughter sleep, grief and longing tangled in his heart. The past couldn't be changed, but perhaps the future still could. The small cottage sat nestled among towering pines far from the busy streets of the city. Its weathered stone walls and green shutters made it look like something from a storybook. For Sterling, it was the safest place he could think of, a property purchased years ago through a shell company, unknown to his father or anyone else at Whitlow Enterprises. "Home, sweet home," Sterling said awkwardly as he carried their bags inside. "At least for now." Ilara stood in the doorway, her thin shoulders hunched, eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. She hadn't spoken a word since that first desperate help in the alley. The doctors had assured him there was nothing physically wrong with her voice. The silence was her choice, her protection. Sterling set down the bags and ran a hand through his silver hair. "Are you hungry? I could make something." He paused. "Though I should warn you, I'm not much of a cook." Ilara's expression didn't change. She simply walked to the window and looked out at the trees. "Right," Sterling sighed. "Well, the kitchen is stocked. Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. I thought maybe you'd like to decorate it yourself. We could go shopping when you feel up to it." Still nothing. Days passed this way. Sterling tried to establish routines. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6. He left books and art supplies on the coffee table. He bought clothes in her size and left them folded on her bed. Small, consistent gestures that he hoped might eventually break through. At night, he'd hear her crying softly in her room. Each sob felt like a knife in his heart, but when he knocked gently on her door, the crying would stop instantly. She didn't want his comfort. Why would she? In her eyes, he was just another stranger. A week into their stay, Sterling sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, legal documents mostly, changes to his will, trust funds being established, preparations for a future where Ilara would be protected no matter what happened to him. He looked up to find her watching him from the doorway. "Just boring grown-up stuff," he said with a small smile. "Would you like some hot chocolate? I think I've finally figured out how to make it without burning the milk." To his surprise, she nodded. It was the first response she'd given to any of his questions. As they sat across from each other, mugs steaming between them, Sterling noticed her eyes drifting to an old leather briefcase propped against the wall. "That's where I keep some personal things," he explained. things that matter to me. Alara's gaze remained fixed on the case. Would you like to see? He asked gently. Another small nod. Sterling retrieved the case and set it on the table. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of items: photographs, letters, a dried flower pressed between glass, a small velvet box. These are memories, he said. Some happy, some sad. All important. He pulled out a faded envelope, its edges worn from handling. This is from your mother. Alara's eyes widened slightly, the most emotion he'd seen from her since they arrived. She wrote this to me a long time ago, Sterling continued, his voice soft. Before everything went wrong. Would you like me to read it to you? When she nodded, Sterling carefully unfolded the letter. His hands trembled slightly as he began to read. My dearest Sterling, last night you asked why I love you. I couldn't answer then. Not because I didn't know, but because there were too many reasons crowding my heart at once. So I'm writing them down now, while you sleep beside me. Sterling's voice caught as he read Renata's beautiful words. How she loved his serious nature, the way his eyes crinkled when he truly smiled. How gentle his hands were despite their strength. With you, I feel seen for the first time in my life, not for what I can give or what I can do, but simply for who I am. That is love, I think, seeing and being seen. And I see you, Sterling Whitlow, beneath all your fancy suits and careful words. I see you and I love what I see. Always, Renata. When he finished, the room was quiet except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Sterling looked up to find tears streaming down Alara's face, silent, like everything about her, but real. She was amazing, he whispered, so brave and kind, so much stronger than I ever was. He reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a photograph. This is her. Your mother. Alara took the photo with trembling fingers. In it, Renata stood laughing by a fountain, her curly hair catching the sunlight, her smile radiant. You have her eyes, Sterling said, and her spirit, I think. Something broke inside Sterling then, a dam he'd built years ago to hold back emotions that threatened to drown him. Tears filled his eyes and spilled over. I'm so sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I should have protected her, protected you. I was a coward, and you both paid the price for my weakness. His shoulders shook as years of buried grief and guilt poured out. I didn't know about you. I swear I didn't know. If I had... He couldn't finish the sentence. I can't change the past, he continued, wiping roughly at his tears. I can't bring her back. I can't give you back the childhood you should have had. But I promise you, Alara, I will spend every day I have left trying to be worthy of being your father. Sterling buried his face in his hands, unable to look at her, certain that his breakdown would only frighten her further. Then he felt it, something so gentle he thought he might have imagined it. A small, warm hand covering his own. He looked up through his tears to find Alara standing beside him. Her face was still streaked with tears, her eyes full of pain and uncertainty. But her hand rested firmly on his. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. It wasn't even trust. Not completely. But it was a beginning. A tiny bridge across the chasm between them. Sterling didn't move, afraid to break this fragile moment. They stayed that way for a long time, connected by that simple touch. a father and daughter finding their way back to each other, one small gesture at a time. The moonlight cast long shadows across the Whitlow estate. In his dimly lit study, Sterling sat reviewing legal documents spread across his desk. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, but sleep was the furthest thing from his mind. Tomorrow he would sign the papers that would ensure Alara's future, making her the rightful heir to everything he owned. His pen hovered over a preliminary signature line. The moment felt weighty, significant. He thought of Roman, lying in his hospital bed, unaware that the empire he'd built would soon belong to the very girl he'd tried to erase. "It's the right thing," Sterling whispered to himself, pressing the pen to paper. As he signed his name, a sense of peace washed over him, the first real peace he'd felt in decades. Across town in a sleek high-rise apartment, a phone rang. Victor Harmon, Roman Whitlow's personal attorney and executor, answered on the second ring. He listened intently, his expression darkening with each word from his informant at the Whitlow estate. "You're certain?" Victor asked, his voice tight. "The paperwork is being filed tomorrow." The confirmation came through clearly. Sterling Whitlow was transferring everything: the shipping empire, the real estate holdings, the family fortune, to a girl named Alara. A girl who, according to all available information, was the daughter Roman had paid to have eliminated years ago. "This cannot stand," Victor said coldly. Mr. Whitlow was explicit in his instructions. The girl is a liability that must be removed. He ended the call and immediately dialed another number. When it connected, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The situation has escalated. Sterling is signing over everything tomorrow. The girl must be dealt with tonight. Permanently." The voice on the other end asked a question. "No witnesses," Victor answered. "Make it look like a break-in and be thorough." He hung up and walked to his window, looking out at the city lights. Roman Whitlow had built an empire through ruthless determination. Victor had spent 30 years protecting that empire by handling the family's problems. This girl, this Alara, was just another problem to solve. Back at the estate, Sterling finally retired to his bedroom. The house was quiet, secure. Alara was sleeping down the hall in what was now her room. For the first time since she'd come into his life, Sterling felt they might actually have a future together. He fell asleep quickly, exhaustion pulling him under. In his dreams, he found himself walking along the shoreline where he and Renata had once spent a perfect summer day. The setting sun painted the water gold, just as it had back then. "You came," said a familiar voice. Sterling turned to find Renata standing there, looking exactly as she had the last time he saw her. Her chestnut curls danced in the breeze, and her eyes held that same mixture of strength and tenderness he remembered. "I've missed you," he said, his dream self reaching for her. She took his hands in hers. Her touch felt impossibly real. "You're doing the right thing," she said, smiling. "Protecting her." "I should have protected you both," Sterling replied, the guilt washing over him even in sleep. Renata shook her head. "The past is written, but tomorrow isn't." Something in her tone made Sterling uneasy. "What do you mean?" Her eyes grew serious. "She's still in danger, Sterling. They'll never stop coming for her." "Who? Roman is dying. He can't hurt her anymore." "Roman built a machine that runs without him," Renata said urgently. "People who protect the Whitlow name at any cost. People who follow orders without question." Fear gripped Sterling's heart. What should I do? Renata's image began to fade around the edges as if she were being pulled away. Don't run this time, she whispered. Stand and fight for her. Renata, wait, Sterling called out, reaching for her vanishing form. Her final words floated to him as she disappeared. She's your daughter. Our daughter. Be the father she deserves. Sterling jerked awake, his heart pounding. Sweat soaked his pajamas, and the echo of Renata's warning still rang in his ears. The bedside clock showed 2:17 a.m. Something had woken him, something beyond the dream. A sound, faint but distinct. The creak of a floorboard where no one should be walking. Sterling slid out of bed, moving silently across his room. Years of business negotiations had taught him to trust his instincts, and every instinct now screamed danger. He grabbed the heavy metal paperweight from his nightstand, the only weapon within reach. Another sound, this one closer to Alara's room. Cold dread washed over him. Renata's warning hadn't been just a dream. It had been a premonition. Sterling slipped into the hallway, staying close to the wall where the floorboards were less likely to creak. The corridor was dark except for the faint glow of security lights. At the far end, a shadow moved, a figure pausing outside Alara's door. Without thinking, Sterling lunged forward. "Get away from her!" he shouted. The intruder spun around. Sterling caught the glint of metal, a gun with a silencer attached. The man raised it, but Sterling was already charging, fueled by a protective rage he'd never felt before. The paperweight connected with the intruder's arm just as the gun fired. The bullet thudded into the wall as Sterling tackled the man to the ground. They crashed against a decorative table, sending a vase shattering across the floor. "Who sent you?" Sterling demanded, struggling to pin the younger, stronger man. Instead of answering, the intruder slammed his head forward, catching Sterling's nose. Pain exploded across his face, but Sterling didn't let go. This man had come for Alara, his daughter, Renata's daughter. "Don't run this time," her voice echoed in his mind. The bedroom door flew open. Alara stood there, eyes wide with terror at the scene before her. "Run!" Sterling shouted to her. "Call security." The distraction cost him. The intruder broke free and scrambled to retrieve his fallen weapon. Sterling lunged again, grabbing the man's legs. They both went down hard, the gun skittering across the polished floor. As they fought, Sterling caught a glimpse of Alara, but instead of running, she was moving toward the gun. "No!" Sterling cried out, terrified she would be hurt. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Alara reached the weapon. The intruder broke free from Sterling and lunged toward her. And Sterling, with a strength he didn't know he possessed, surged forward to place himself between his daughter and danger. The gun skittered across the floor as Sterling and the intruder grappled. Alara stood frozen, her small hand hovering over the weapon. The intruder broke free from Sterling's grasp and lunged toward her. "No!" Sterling roared, throwing himself between them. The man's fist connected with Sterling's jaw, sending him staggering back. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, but he remained standing, arms spread wide to shield Alara. "Run!" he commanded her again, his voice thick with determination. This time, Alara darted away, disappearing down the hallway. The intruder cursed and tried to follow, but Sterling grabbed him by the collar, yanking him backward with surprising strength. "You don't touch her," Sterling growled, landing a solid punch that sent the man reeling. Security alarms suddenly blared throughout the house. Alara had reached the panic button Sterling had shown her. The sound distracted the intruder just long enough for Sterling to deliver another blow. The man stumbled, then fled down the stairs and out through a side door. Sterling's security team burst in moments later, but the damage was done. The sanctity of their home had been violated. Someone had gotten past all his defenses. "We need to leave," Sterling told his head of security. "Now, prepare the lake house." Within an hour, as the first hints of dawn colored the sky, Sterling and Alara were speeding toward his remote property nestled in the mountains. Alara sat silent in the back seat, her small body curled tight against the door. "You were very brave back there," Sterling said softly. She didn't respond, but her eyes met his in the rearview mirror, frightened but trusting. Something had shifted between them tonight. He had proven he would protect her no matter what. "We'll be safe at the lake house," he assured her. "No one knows about it except my most trusted people." The property came into view as they rounded a curve in the mountain road, a modern structure of glass and stone, partially hidden among towering pines. It overlooked a small, private lake that glittered in the first rays of sunlight. "It's beautiful," Alara whispered, her first words since the attack. Sterling's heart warmed at her soft voice. "Your mother would have loved it here." They settled in quickly. The house had been stocked with supplies for emergencies exactly like this one. Sterling made Alara pancakes for breakfast, and for a brief moment, the danger felt distant. As the sun rose higher, painting the lake in golden light, Sterling stepped onto the back deck to call his lawyer. Alara was safely inside, drawing at the kitchen table where he could see her through the glass door. "I need to make arrangements for her," Sterling explained into the phone. "Guardianship papers, legal protection, everything." The lawyer promised to handle it immediately. As Sterling ended the call, movement in the trees across the lake caught his eye. A flash of something metallic reflecting the sunlight. His blood turned to ice. Sterling burst back into the house. "Alara, get down!" The windows exploded inward as gunfire erupted. Sterling dove across the room, tackling Alara to the floor behind the solid kitchen island, just as bullets splintered the wood where she had been sitting seconds before. "How did they find us?" she whimpered, trembling violently in his arms. "It doesn't matter," Sterling said, his mind racing. "There's a hidden room. We need to get to it." Keeping low, he guided her toward the pantry. At the back, behind a shelf of canned goods, was a concealed door leading to a secure panic room. As they crawled, more bullets tore through the house. The attackers were getting closer. "Almost there," Sterling encouraged, pushing the shelf aside to reveal the hidden entrance. The front door crashed open. Heavy footsteps pounded across the floor. "Get in," Sterling whispered urgently, opening the panic room. "Lock it behind you." Alara grabbed his sleeve. "You're coming too." "I'll hold them off. Buy time for help to arrive." He pressed the panic button on his watch, activating the emergency signal to his security team. "Go." Tears filled her eyes. "Please." "I promise I'll come back for you," Sterling said, gently pushing her into the safe room. "I won't leave you." As the hidden door closed, Sterling turned to face the intruders. 3 men in tactical gear swept into the kitchen, weapons raised. "Where's the girl?" the leader demanded. "Gone," Sterling answered, standing tall. "You're too late." The man's eyes narrowed. "Search the house," he ordered the others. Sterling knew he had to keep them away from the pantry. With a desperate lunge, he grabbed a knife from the counter and charged at the nearest attacker. The element of surprise gave him an advantage. The man fell back, clutching a bleeding arm. But the leader was quicker. The gunshot echoed through the house as searing pain tore through Sterling's side. He stumbled, pressing his hand against the wound as blood seeped between his fingers. Still, he remained standing between the attackers and the pantry. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. His security team was minutes away. He just needed to hold on. "It's over," Sterling gasped through the pain. Law enforcement knows about Roman's plans, about what he did to Renata. Uncertainty flickered across the leader's face. The sirens grew louder. "Finish him," he ordered one of his men, backing toward the door. "Then find the girl." The man raised his weapon, but a crash from outside distracted him. Sterling's security team had arrived. The attackers fled, disappearing through the back as vehicles screeched to a halt outside. Sterling collapsed against the wall, sliding down to the floor as his strength failed him. Blood pooled beneath him, too much blood. With trembling fingers, he pressed the hidden switch to open the panic room. "It's safe now," he called weakly. The door slid open and Alara rushed out. Her scream pierced the air when she saw him lying there, blood soaking his shirt. "No!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. "Please, no!" Sterling's vision blurred as she pressed her small hands against his wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. "Stay awake," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please stay awake, Dad." The word cut through his fading consciousness. Dad. She had called him Dad. Sterling fought against the darkness pulling at him. Security personnel flooded the room, followed by paramedics. But all he could focus on was Alara's face, her hands still pressing against his wound. "Don't leave me," she sobbed. "Dad, please don't leave me." "I won't," he whispered, reaching up to touch her tear-stained cheek. "I promised." The last thing Sterling saw before unconsciousness claimed him was Alara's frightened face as the paramedics gently moved her aside to work on him. Dad. She had called him Dad. Sterling floated in darkness. Voices drifted in and out, muffled and distant. Sometimes he thought he heard Alara calling for him. Other times he was sure he felt her small hand squeezing his. But the darkness kept pulling him back under. Then, slowly, the darkness began to lift. The first thing Sterling noticed was the steady beeping of machines. Then came the antiseptic smell and the scratchy feel of hospital sheets. Pain throbbed dully in his side, held at bay by medication. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids felt impossibly heavy. "Dad?" A small voice broke through the fog. "The doctor said you might wake up today." Dad. There was that word again. Sterling fought against the heaviness, forcing his eyes open. The hospital room came into focus. White walls, medical equipment, sunlight streaming through half-drawn blinds. And there, perched on a chair pulled right up to his bedside, was Alara. Her face was pale with dark circles under her eyes. Her hair had been brushed and pulled back into a neat ponytail. Someone had been taking care of her. But her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. "You're here," Sterling whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. Alara's face lit up. "You're awake!" She jumped to her feet, leaning over the bed rail. "The doctor said you lost a lot of blood. You've been asleep for 3 days." 3 days. Sterling tried to shift and winced at the pain in his side. "Don't move," Alara said quickly. "The bullet went all the way through, but they had to do surgery." Sterling reached out with a shaky hand. Alara took it immediately, her small fingers wrapping around his. "You stayed," he said. "Of course I stayed." Her voice trembled slightly. "You promised you wouldn't leave me. So I promised I wouldn't leave you either." Something broke open inside Sterling's chest. Tears welled in his eyes and spilled over before he could stop them. He hadn't cried since the day he'd learned of Renata's death. Now the tears came freely, streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, not sure if he was apologizing for crying or for everything that had happened. Alara didn't pull away or look embarrassed. Instead, she reached out with her free hand and gently wiped his tears away. "It's okay," she said softly. "Sometimes you need to cry." The simple wisdom in her words only made Sterling cry harder. All the years of regret, of living behind walls, of denying himself the right to grieve, it all came pouring out. And through it all, Alara kept holding his hand, occasionally wiping away his tears with a tissue she'd grabbed from the bedside table. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Sterling quickly tried to compose himself as a familiar figure entered the room. "James," Sterling acknowledged his lawyer, hastily wiping his face. James Bennett had been Sterling's attorney for 15 years. He looked unusually somber as he approached the bed, nodding respectfully to Alara. "Good to see you awake," James said. "You gave everyone quite a scare." "What's happened?" Sterling asked, instantly alert to his lawyer's serious expression. James glanced at Alara, then back to Sterling. "Perhaps we should speak privately." "No," Sterling said firmly. "Whatever it is, she can hear it. We don't have secrets anymore." James nodded, understanding. "Roman is dead." The words hung in the air. Sterling felt Alara's hand tighten in his. "How?" Sterling asked. "Stroke. 2 days ago." James set his briefcase on the foot of the bed. "The doctors say the stress of the investigation likely triggered it. The authorities were closing in. Your evidence was damning." Sterling felt strangely hollow. For years he had feared his father, then hated him. Now, the man was simply gone. "There's more," James continued. "The files you sent me before the attack, I've released them all, as instructed. Every document implicating your family in Renata's death and the subsequent cover-up. The financial records showing the bribes, the offshore accounts, all of it. And," Sterling prompted, "and the Whitlow name is in ruins. The company stock has plummeted. The board is in chaos. The authorities have frozen most of the family assets pending investigation." James shook his head. "It's exactly what you wanted. The truth is out." Sterling nodded slowly. He had destroyed his family's legacy, the empire his ancestors had built over generations. Yet he felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only relief that it was finally over. "Thank you, James," he said quietly. The lawyer nodded, picking up his briefcase. "I'll give you some time. We'll need to discuss next steps when you're stronger." After James left, silence filled the room. Sterling turned to look at Alara, who had been watching him intently. "Are you sad?" she asked. "About your father?" Sterling considered the question. "Not sad exactly. I stopped knowing him a long time ago." He paused. "But I am sorry for the man he could have been." Ilara nodded, seeming to understand. Ilara, Sterling said, his voice growing serious. Everyone knows now. About what my family did. About what I did. Abandoning your mother. The Whitlow name means nothing anymore. It might even be something people hate. He took a deep breath, fear tightening his chest. Now that all this has happened, would you still want to stay with me? The question hung between them, heavy with vulnerability. Sterling held his breath, suddenly terrified of her answer. Ilara studied him for a long moment, her eyes, so like her mother's, searching his face. When I was hiding, living on the streets, she said slowly, I used to dream about having a family. Not a fancy house or lots of money. Just someone who would look for me if I went missing. Someone who would fight for me. She squeezed his hand. You got shot protecting me. You gave up everything to tell the truth about my mom. I don't care about your last name. I care that you came back for me when you promised you would. Tears filled Sterling's eyes again. So you'll stay? Yes, Ilara said simply. I'll stay. Days turned into weeks. Sterling's wounds healed slowly, leaving scars that would forever mark his skin, visible reminders of the day he'd finally chosen love over legacy. As soon as the doctors cleared him for travel, Sterling made a decision that shocked the business world but felt utterly right to him. He retired completely from public life and walked away from what remained of the Whitlow empire. Are you sure? James had asked when Sterling signed the final paperwork. Sterling had simply nodded, feeling lighter than he had in decades. More sure than I've ever been about anything. With the money that was rightfully his, funds he'd earned and kept separate from the family business, Sterling purchased a modest farmhouse beside a quiet lake, 3 hours from the city. The property sat on 5 acres of gently rolling land with old oak trees and a view of water that turned golden at sunset. On moving day, Ilara pressed her face against the car window as they drove up the gravel driveway. It's so quiet, she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Too quiet? Sterling asked, suddenly uncertain. She shook her head. It feels safe. The farmhouse needed work. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown. But that became part of their healing. Together, they spent mornings fixing things, afternoons exploring the property, and evenings sitting on the porch watching fireflies dance over the lake. One warm Saturday, Sterling brought home a dozen packets of marigold seeds. These were your mother's favorite, he told Ilara as they stood in what would become their garden. She always said they were like little suns that never stopped shining. Ilara took the packets, running her fingers over the bright pictures on the front. Can we plant them everywhere? Everywhere, Sterling promised. They worked side by side, digging small holes in the rich earth. Sterling showed Ilara how to space the seeds, how deep to plant them, how to water them gently. Her small hands worked with careful precision, her face serious with concentration. Mom would like this place, wouldn't she? Ilara asked as they patted soil over the last seeds. She would love it, Sterling said, his voice catching. And she would love seeing you here. As spring warmed into summer, the marigolds began to bloom. First a few tentative flowers, then clusters of brilliant orange and yellow blossoms that seemed to catch and hold the sunlight. One rainy afternoon, while Sterling was sorting through some boxes he'd brought from his old apartment, Ilara appeared in the doorway of his study. "What's this?" she asked, holding up a faded blue scarf with tiny embroidered flowers along the edge. Sterling's breath caught. That was your mother's. Ilara's eyes widened. She brought the scarf closer, her fingers tracing the delicate stitching. Then, with a gentleness that broke Sterling's heart, she pressed the fabric to her cheek and closed her eyes. It still smells like her, she whispered, tears beginning to spill down her face. I didn't think I remembered, but I do. Sterling crossed the room and knelt beside her. Without hesitation, Ilara fell into his arms, clutching the scarf between them as she cried, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her small frame. I miss her, she gasped between tears. I miss her so much. I know, sweetheart, Sterling murmured, holding her tight as his own tears fell. I miss her too. Summer brought new life to the farmhouse. The marigolds that Sterling and Ilara had planted together now formed bright patches of color across the yard, like splashes of sunshine against the green grass. The garden they'd started was thriving too, rows of tomatoes, bell peppers, and green beans stretching toward the sky. Do you think this one's ready? Ilara asked one warm morning, pointing to a plump tomato hanging heavy on the vine. Sterling knelt beside her, his knees pressing into the soft earth. Let's see, he said, gently touching the fruit. If it comes off easily, that means it's ready. With careful fingers, Ilara gave the tomato a small twist. It separated from the vine with barely any resistance, and she held it up triumphantly. Our first one, she exclaimed, her face glowing with pride. That evening, they sliced the tomato and added it to their salad. It was a simple meal, chicken they'd cooked together, rice and vegetables from their garden. But to Sterling, it tasted better than any five-star restaurant meal he'd ever had. As the days lengthened, they fell into comfortable routines. Mornings were for chores and gardening. Afternoons often found them reading together on the porch swing. Ilara's small body tucked against Sterling's side as he read aloud from books they picked out together at the local library. One more chapter, Ilara would beg when Sterling reached the end of a section, and he almost always gave in. Every evening after dinner, they would take a walk down to the lake, sometimes skipping stones across the still water. Other times just sitting quietly as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. And each night after tucking Ilara into bed, Sterling would sit at the small desk in his room and write to Renata. He told her about their daughter, how brave she was, how smart, how her laugh sounded like wind chimes in a summer breeze. She has your eyes, Renata, he wrote one night, and your heart. Sometimes when she looks at me, I see you looking back. He kept these letters in a wooden box that Ilara had painted with bright flowers and stars. Each night, he would slide the box under her bed, a ritual that somehow made both of them feel that Renata was still with them, watching over their sleep. Do you think Mom can read them? Ilara had asked when Sterling first explained what he was doing. I believe she knows what's in our hearts, Sterling had answered, surprised by how true the words felt. As summer deepened, Sterling found himself smiling more. The weight he'd carried for so many years had begun to lift. Sometimes, catching his reflection in a window, he barely recognized himself. The softness in his eyes, the ease in his shoulders. You look happy, Ilara told him one evening as they washed dishes together, she drying while he washed. Sterling paused, soapy hands dripping into the sink. I am happy, he said, realizing with wonder that it was true. Are you? Ilara nodded, her face serious. I still miss Mom, but I'm not scared anymore. Sterling pulled her close, not caring that his wet hands dampened her shirt. That's all I want, he whispered against her hair. For you to feel safe and loved. That night, as he wrote his letter to Renata, Sterling felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. We're finding our way, he wrote, together. The morning dawned bright and clear, perfect for a special day. Sterling woke before sunrise, his heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Today was Alara's birthday, her first one they would celebrate together as father and daughter. He tiptoed past her bedroom door, careful not to wake her. In the kitchen, he spread out the ingredients he'd secretly purchased days before. Flour, sugar, eggs, vanilla extract, and cocoa powder. The cookbook lay open on the counter, its pages already smudged with fingerprints from his practice attempts. How hard can this be? Sterling muttered to himself as he measured flour into a bowl. The answer came 3 hours later. Flour dusted his hair and clothes, chocolate smears decorated his cheeks, and a lopsided cake sat cooling on the wire rack. It wasn't pretty. One side had risen higher than the other, and the frosting he'd made was a bit too runny, but it was made with love. Sterling heard the soft padding of feet on the stairs just as he finished writing, "Happy Birthday, Alara," in wobbly letters across the top of the cake. "Dad?" Alara called, rubbing sleep from her eyes as she entered the kitchen. She stopped short, taking in the mess and the cake and Sterling's flour-covered appearance. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," Sterling said, suddenly feeling shy and uncertain. Alara's eyes widened. "You made me a cake?" "I tried," Sterling admitted with a small laugh. "It's not exactly bakery quality." Alara approached the counter slowly, her eyes fixed on the chocolate creation. "It's perfect," she whispered, and the sincerity in her voice made Sterling's chest tighten with emotion. "I have something else for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Two things, actually." From his pocket, Sterling pulled out a small, ornately carved wooden box. The varnish had faded in spots, and one corner showed signs of repair, but the roses etched into the lid were still beautiful. "This belonged to your mother," Sterling said softly, placing it in Alara's hands. "It's a music box." Alara's fingers traced the carved flowers. "Mom's?" Sterling nodded. She loved music. This was one of the few things she kept from her childhood. With trembling fingers, Alara opened the lid. A gentle melody filled the kitchen, a lullaby, sweet and somehow familiar. Alara closed her eyes, swaying slightly to the music. "I remember this," she whispered. "She used to hum it when she tucked me in." Sterling watched her, his own eyes growing damp. "There's one more thing," he said when the music finally wound down. From his other pocket, he produced a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. On one side was engraved Alara's name. On the other, a tiny etching of a marigold, the flowers they'd planted together. "Oh," Alara breathed, lifting the necklace from its box. Tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. "Do you like it?" Sterling asked anxiously. "I wanted something that would be just yours, something special that—" His words were cut off as Alara threw her arms around his waist, burying her face against his chest. Her small body shook with quiet sobs. "Thank you," she managed between tears. "It's beautiful." Sterling held her close, his own eyes overflowing. After a moment, he gently lifted her chin. "Here, let me put it on you." With fingers that weren't quite steady, he fastened the necklace around her neck. The silver heart gleamed against her skin. "Perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Ilara touched the pendant, her eyes serious as she looked up at him. "Dad," she began, and the words still had the power to make Sterling's heart skip a beat. "I know Grandpa wanted you to have the big house and all the money and stuff." Sterling nodded, unsure where she was going with this. "But I don't need any of that," Ilara continued, her voice growing stronger. "I don't need the mansion or the money." Her fingers curled around the heart pendant. "Just you." The simplicity of her declaration struck Sterling like a physical blow. All those years of chasing his father's approval, of believing that worth came from wealth and power, and here was this child, his child, cutting through it all with a few honest words. "Just me?" he echoed, his voice barely audible. "Just you," Ilara confirmed, reaching up to wipe a tear from his cheek. "You're my dad. That's all I ever wanted." Sterling gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in a tight embrace. In that moment, he understood what true wealth was, and he had never felt richer. Sterling stared at his daughter, overwhelmed by her simple words. "Just you." The walls he'd built around his heart for decades, the careful barriers that had protected him from pain but also from love, crumbled completely. His knees weakened. His shoulders began to shake. And then, right there in their modest kitchen with the lopsided birthday cake between them, Sterling Whitlow broke down. The tears came first, not the dignified, controlled tears he'd allowed himself on rare occasions, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very core of his being. Years of grief over losing Renata, decades of guilt for abandoning her, the crushing weight of knowing what his choices had cost this precious child standing before him. "I'm sorry," he gasped between sobs, his hands covering his face. "I'm so sorry, Ilara. I should have been there. I should have protected you both." Sterling felt small arms wrap around his waist as he sank to the kitchen floor. Instead of pulling away from his breakdown, Ilara moved closer. She held him tightly, her small body somehow strong enough to anchor him through the storm of emotion. "It's okay, Dad," she whispered, her cheek pressed against his shoulder. "It's okay now." Sterling couldn't stop the flow of words and tears. "I missed so much. Your first steps, your first words. I wasn't there when you needed me." Ilara's arms tightened around him. "But you found me," she said simply. "You came back." Sterling looked at her through tear-blurred eyes. This child who had suffered so much, who had watched her mother die, who had lived on the streets, hunted and afraid, was comforting him. The pure grace of it broke his heart all over again. "How can you forgive me so easily?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Ilara considered this, her eyes thoughtful beyond her years. "Mom always said that holding on to hurt only makes your heart heavy." She touched the silver pendant at her throat. "And my heart was so heavy for so long, I don't want it to be heavy anymore." Sterling gathered her into his arms, cradling her as he should have done from the day she was born. They sat together on the kitchen floor, the birthday cake forgotten, as minutes passed in healing silence. Finally, Sterling took a deep breath. "I think," he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, "that we could both use some fresh air. Would you like to see how our garden is doing?" Ilara nodded, her face brightening. She stood up and offered her small hand to help him rise, a gesture so innocent yet profound that it nearly undid Sterling again. Hand in hand, they walked through the back door of their cottage and into the yard where they had planted marigolds together months ago. What had started as a small patch had spread into a glorious riot of orange and gold blooms that seemed to capture the sunlight itself. The flowers danced in the gentle breeze, their spicy scent filling the air. Sterling felt something shift inside him as he looked at the garden they had created together. Not the formal, manicured gardens of the Whitlow estate, but something wild and joyful and alive. Ilara let go of his hand and ran ahead, spinning among the flowers with her arms outstretched. The silver heart pendant caught the sunlight, flashing brilliantly against her dress. She looked so much like Renata in that moment that Sterling's breath caught. When she turned back to him, her face was radiant with simple happiness. She came back to his side and slipped her hand into his again. "Thank you for coming back for me, Dad," she whispered, looking up at him with eyes that held no blame, only love. The wind rustled gently through the marigolds. Birds called to each other from nearby trees. And in that perfect, ordinary moment, Sterling felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, a sense of wholeness, of being exactly where he was meant to be. If you enjoyed the story of Sterling and Ilara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.